Well, welcome to another edition of Ragged Theology Podcast. And today we're delighted to welcome an old friend of mine, Mike Royal. Good to see you, Mike.
Great to be here, thank you.
So Mike is co-chief executive of the Cinnamon Network, something I used to have a lot to do with. And if you haven't heard of the Cinnamon Network, please check out their website. Mike, great to have you with us. Tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and your current role.
Yeah, my name's Mike Royal. I'm of Jamaican heritage. I was born in the UK. Both of my parents are from Jamaica, from the Windrush Generation, came over in the 1950s. My mother was a homemaker, but my father actually was a deputy head teacher. So I was very fortunate to grow up in an environment where education was really valued. My first profession was as an urban planner, and I worked in urban planning for 3 years across a London context before coming into ministry in 1993 at the tender age of 25. Quickly got involved in social action ministry in the church. First of all, as one of the founding trustees of Transforming Lives for Good, TLG, and I rolled out their program of alternative education provision, particularly in England. Been involved in running street pastors here now in Birmingham, which I've been here since 2003, and more recently involved in Cinnamon Network and took over as co-chief executive in 2018.
Just tell us a bit more about the Windrush Generation for those who perhaps don't know. What is the Windrush Generation?
And so after the war, the whole of Great Britain, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England was really struggling. Lots of the cities had been bombed. There was a lot of poverty, and there was actually a call from the British government to the empire, as it was then, for people to come and help rebuild the country after the war. And the truth was that countries like Jamaica in the Caribbean were being run in such a way that actually it was really difficult to get on and get up in that country. And so a number of people from Jamaica kind of came across to the UK in 1948 on a boat called the Windrush, and then over the course of the next 2 decades, the 50s and 60s, people came. My parents came in the late 50s, settled in London, in Clapham actually, right by the church of the Clapham sect, and then later moved out to the suburbs, but others settled in other cities, including Glasgow, including Birmingham, Manchester, and other places.
Yeah, I've been reading Ben Lindsay's book, We Need to Talk About Race, recently, and he mentions in the book, there's obviously a lot of racism that the Windrush Generation experienced, but there was also some examples of how the churches welcomed many of those who came across in the Windrush. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it was a mixed picture. I live here in Birmingham, and there are known examples of churches here in Birmingham who welcomed people from the Windrush Generation. And there are some known examples, sadly, of people who, when those people turned up at their church, actually said, don't come back, please. And so what you've had as well was the setting up of lots of new churches, particularly Pentecostal churches. But many of the people from the Caribbean actually were part of the more historic denominations, including the Presbyterian Church. My mother was Presbyterian. Methodist Church, Anglican churches, Catholic churches. And that's still the case. If you come to urban Birmingham, I'm here in Handsworth. All three of the churches in this parish are high Anglo-Catholic churches, and all of them, and two of them in particular, two of the three churches are predominantly black churches as well.
So before we get on to talk a bit more about sort of racial diversity and some of these issues, just tell us a bit more about the Cinnamon Network. You're very involved in the UK church. I mean, what's your kind of vision for the church, and why did you get involved in the Cinnamon Network?
Yes, I mean, so, before Cinnamon, I'd been involved with transforming lives for good, working with children and young people at risk of exclusion from school, through both early intervention, but also particularly my involvement was with rolling out their alternative provision. And actually Cinnamon Network was an opportunity to paint on a broader canvas in that sort of emerging movement that's kind of emerged across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland over the last 20 years around the church and social justice. Very much the Cinnamon Network aimed to sort of bring some of the sort of key people in that movement together, and to really encourage churches to lean into the social action and social justice agenda. And so that's our role. We are about enabling the church to engage well in community development, and do it in a gospel-centered way too.
But fundamentally, the Cinnamon Network is about providing micro grants to set up projects that are tried and tested. Would that be a fair summary?
And that's part of what we do. I think the other part is about walking with church leaders, walking alongside them, helping them to think deeply about how they do community engagement well. And of course, we're constantly looking to incubate new projects. And so we've got an incubation competition that we've just launched, and that is looking at the issue of unemployment, of learning and training. And so we're really excited to kind of find the next organisations that are going to be the street pastors and the Christians Against Poverty and the safer families for children of the next generation. So, yeah.
So as you know, Mike, I work for Safe Families, and recently we've been having a conversation about race. We've been on the back of George Floyd's murder last year. We've been journeying around about racial diversity. Can you tell us a bit about your own reaction to George Floyd's murder last year and the spread of the Black Lives Matter movement, and just what was your own emotions around that whole time?
I think, like anyone, the human or the inhumanness of the moment, I found traumatic as a Black person. I found that traumatic. And so on one hand, I was dealing with my own pain and trauma of seeing that on our TV. And let's remember, we were all in lockdown. And so something that would have been missed by many was seen by all. And that's why actually the movement was so global. But also I had people beginning to text me, and I realized, particularly in the Black community, that actually there was a real need for pastoral care in my community. And so that was a real focus, that there were lots of people who just wanted to talk and needed pastoral care. And my first love is pastoring people. But then, of course, beyond that, it's also about being a prophetic voice. And I felt that it was important that I was a voice who stood up and spoke out and began to help the church to really face this situation. someone put this on their social media recently, and I want to just read it. And it says this: white supremacy won't die until white people see it as a white issue they need to solve, rather than a black issue they need to empathize with. And that was by Greg Morris. And I think it's a powerful statement. And so I wanted just to help white people to begin to lean into this agenda.
Some Christians would be slightly critical of the Black Lives Movement. They would say that they disagree with many things that the Black Lives Movement stand for. How would you respond to that? You know, what should our theology be around standing with against racial prejudice?
My reaction would be this: movements, and let's understand Black Lives Matter, I'd say small letters. We're not talking about the organization here, we're talking about actually a movement that is global. And so actually it's a coming together of quite a wide variety of thoughts. So while there are definitely some who, you know, some would say, well, those are very Marxist views that I cannot buy into, I think that there's a recognition that actually that the Black Lives Matter is a broader movement than that, and that the principle of standing for racial justice in this moment is something that I think we can all climb on board. So I would ask people, you know, not just to say, oh, well, Black Lives Matter was, you know, started by, you know, 3 queer women, so we're not going to get involved, but actually to recognize that actually Black Lives Matter, small letters, is a movement that's standing for racial justice. And actually it's a movement that has considerable support from Black Christians here in the UK, as well as in other places like the US and around the globe. I think that the thing for me that Black Lives Matter movement has done was to amplify voices of a whole generation that previously we had written off as being snowflakes. And suddenly I was driving through Birmingham, driving through Moseley in Birmingham, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There was this young girl, probably about 11 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, walking down the street on her own with a placard on the front saying Black Lives Matter, and on her back as well. And I just thought, I've never seen anything like this before. And everyone was giving her a toot just to encourage her. But I realized, gosh, a whole generation is standing up, and this has caught the imagination of that generation. We've got to get behind this.
Yeah. I think I was saying to you, I've been really challenged recently by Ben Lindsay's book, We Need to Talk About Race. And, you know, one of the quotes in the book, when Ben Lindsay quotes Anthony Bradley, he says this quote, he says, generally in the Black church, you learn about Jesus through Moses, evangelicals through Paul. That's why evangelicals struggle with social issues. And Lindsay goes on to say the church should be presenting the lion as well as the lamb of Jesus's character. People who are struggling to survive day to day need to hear about the God of justice who will fight on their behalf, as well as the God of grace who will provide salvation and reconciliation. I wondered, I mean, how can we in the UK church think about justice more biblically and differently, so that we can actually challenge discrimination properly, as some of our forefathers have done?
Yeah, the scripture, Micah 6:8, he has shown you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And walking with God, showing mercy and acting justly have always been integral to our Christian walk, and is a biblical imperative. And I think that the tradition of civil rights movement is something that We can draw from other places in the world. We are a global faith, so we can draw from the likes of Martin Luther King and more recently just passed away, of course, John Lewis. I love John Lewis's great quote, "Get into good trouble." And then, but we can look to places like South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement and think of Desmond Tutu, but a host of others, drawn from actually a really broad spectrum, from, you know, socially conservative, you know, right through to more liberal. These are broad movements, and this is the kind of movement, I think, that is now building here in the UK. And so I welcome the fact that the Church of England, for example, have just brought out their report From Lament to Action, which acknowledges institutional racism in the church. And so actually this is something that we are being called to lean into. Acting justly is part of our faith. And just on the lion and the lamb thing, which I think you alluded to earlier, I do think that we need that balance of scripture. I am an evangelical, and so I too was brought up on Paul, but there's a liberating narrative in Exodus that Black spirituality has always drawn strength from, as God people were released from slavery. So that is a mirror of our journey, particularly over the last 400 years. So we have to recognize that journey of the Black lived experience, particularly over the last 400 years.
Just some of those examples that you gave about some of the churches in the Windrush Generation, South Africa. How do you think America? Yeah. How do you think the church, you know, got it so badly wrong in terms of racial integration and, you know, equality? I mean, a cursory glance at the Bible would suggest, you know, man is made in the image of God, we're made equal. You know, how do you think that theology went so badly wrong that people would, you know, segregate churches and stuff?
Yeah, I think very, very sadly, the missionary endeavour from this country, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, and even crossing over into the 20th century, sadly was very much linked to colonialism and colonial rule. As one person kind of once put it, you know, they got the land and we got the Bible. But actually church history, when you go back, is so different from that. You know, after the Pentecost and the apostolic church age, actually the church grew south, you know, before it grew west. It grew east, you know, St. Thomas planted 14 churches in India in AD 52. The early desert fathers, you know, were African. And so the early influences on Celtic Christianity in this country were actually African influences. And indeed, there were Africans who were coming to Britain and making an impact. My own denomination, the Apostolic Pastoral Congress, our patron is St. Hadrian of Canterbury, who came over in the late 600s, died about 709. For 40 years, he led the theological school in Canterbury, and was actually offered the archbishopric twice and turned it down in humility. This is rich history. You know, the Ethiopian church declared itself Christian in AD 400. But all of that influence from Africa happened without any empire building. It was pure gospel. Sadly, when that came from Britain in the 18th and 19th century. Sadly, it came with colonialism, and somehow we've got to decouple ourselves from that. And I think that's what the Lament to Action report is trying to grapple with. One last thing from me, as I say, I'm married into a Ghanaian family. I can take anyone who is listening to this call, I can take you to Ghana, I can take you to Cape Coast Slave Castle, and I can show you where they built a church on top of a slave dungeon. They were worshipping and singing to the Lord while slaves were underneath going to meet their death in the Black Atlantic as they travel from Africa to the Caribbean and Americas. How did that happen? I think actually that's a question that I can't answer, but it's a question that I think that my white brothers and sisters need to grapple with.
Yeah, I think it's a lesson for us today as well, isn't it? That we need to be so open to blind spots theologically, and that we read the Bible so often with a particular lens, don't we?
Yes, indeed.
I mean, very, very connected to this, but again, something that Lindsay said in his book. As a black person, I struggle with the continued fascination with the fetishization of black children in Africa, but the lack of interest in black children suffering in the UK. Which a quote that just really hit me like a train. I mean, you kind of answered this question already, but how can we sort of reorientate our view of mission so that we care at least about as much as about the oppression of black kids in the UK as we do of poor kids in Africa?
Yeah, I do think there needs to be an acknowledgement that over the years that somehow people have there are some people wicked enough to get some pleasure out of black trauma. But I think more often than not, people get that sort of quiet middle-class satisfaction from the fact, well, it's much worse in Africa or Asia than it is kind of here. It's really interesting, even at church this week, a couple of people just sort of prayed for India, and they were praying, oh Lord, let us send some aid to India, and vaccines. Let us share the vaccines. We have plenty, but they don't. But I find myself praying behind that. Lord, remind us and I'm a health chaplain, when our hospitals were being overrun. I can tell you in Birmingham, our hospitals were at 100% capacity. When we were on our knees, that was only a few months back. Remind us of that. Help us then to be gracious to others. And so what am I saying here? I'm kind of saying that there is a need to understand that if you're going to love your neighbor in the majority world, then actually you also need to love your neighbor here as well in the minority world. And so if you're going to give to children in need in parts of the continent of Africa or of Asia or of South America, then what about the black young people on our streets who perhaps are getting involved in negative peer groups, or who are perhaps being criminalized by the police, or who are perhaps being let down by poor educational system in the city areas? We need to be as concerned about that as we are about kind of making ourselves kind of feel good by kind of doing kind of what I call poverty porn, really, and kind of going, oh, isn't it terrible out there? Let's see if we can do something. We just need to move away from that and be honest about some of that stuff as well. Some of us feel smug about being able to kind of be a little bit of a white savior to those poor African or Asian children.
You were chatting
That's
about
tough stuff to hear, I know, but I kind of want to say that.
You were chatting about the spread of the African church, and there's a quote in Lindsay's book from Augustine of Hippo, a famous quote: "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger that things are the way they are, and courage to see that they do not remain that way." I suppose just kind of finishing off, Mike. I suppose how can we, balance anger at the way things are, but also courage to make them different? I mean, what's your own kind of what's a takeaway for us, I suppose, from this podcast as to
Yeah,
how we can um,
yeah,
how we can change things?
yeah. I think really important is for us to look at our own churches and our own organizations, um, and actually kind of ask ourselves, are there some attitudes firstly that we need to change? At the moment in Cinnamon Network, we've got a small book club going. We're looking at the book We and White Supremacy. Actually, that's been led by a white colleague of mine, Mark Kitson, who I know you know really well, and that's been a great discussion. So we need to kind of do the reading. We need to begin to listen to voices and follow voices, black voices that are speaking up, and not judge them, not assume you think you know what box they fit in. A lot of people would want to kind of put me in a liberal box. I'm a Pentecostal bishop. There isn't much liberal about me. And so actually listen to what we are saying. We're trying to help the church to grapple with these issues. I think we need to audit our organizations and ask us and our churches and ask ourselves if we are sitting in communities where there's diversity, which many of us are all over the country, and not just in the big cities of England, but in Scotland, in parts of Wales, then it's really important that our organisations are representative of those communities, but also we us are equipping ourselves to serve those communities on the ground well, in a way that recognise the sanctity of each human life. Because at the end of the day, this stuff hits the ground when we engage with everyday people. That for me is the way to go. And that's how we become allies. I think I want to kind of use that word. Some people don't like that word, but I have appreciated people who've stood up and been allies to the Black community, particularly in this moment.
I think we've been in that kind of journey in Safe Families, and we've been rolling out workshops. We've been watching a TED talk by Nora Reid, which is really, really powerful. And we've been doing some auditing as well, and asking questions: how diverse are we? In terms of the communities that we serve. I think in some communities, for example, in Scotland, it's very easy to say, well, there's almost no Black people, but actually, when you look at things, there are quite a few. And are we reaching them? Are we recruiting them? So it's only when you audit you can start asking some serious questions. So.
And I think it's really important. I mean, one of the things I would reflect on this in this country at the moment, that actually, interestingly enough, there is something called reverse mission that's taking place. With some of our strongest churches are, the African Caribbean Windrush churches, the African churches, some of the more recent Asian churches, and other minority communities who have come, who've enriched the Christian faith, and actually, if I may say so, saved this country from completely falling into the hands of secularism. And I think that there just needs to be a recognition of that reverse mission that has taken place. Yes, Britain took the gospel around the world, albeit mixed in with a lot of empire and colonialism and some slavery in the mix. But actually, there has been that reverse mission. And I go back to what I said about first century Christianity, that the influencers on Celtic Christianity that we love to talk about so often in these islands were actually the African desert fathers. We've always walked hand in hand together. This is a global movement, this Christian movement, and may we understand and recognize its globalness as we lean into our local communities and seek to serve people from every tribe, tongue and nation.
No, I mean, it's been a real privilege for me to be part of a pastor's prayer group on a Thursday morning in Edinburgh, and some of our African brothers, you know, if we had half of their enthusiasm and their zeal for prayer, you know, we would have a very different country, you know, and we have so much to learn from each other. But you know, it saddens me, as I'm sure it saddens you, that so often black and white people are worshipping in different churches, and there's not always the overlap that there should be, you know.
Yes, but I think the key thing is that we are finding ways and continue to find ways to draw together and stand together, particularly in moments of controversy. And the death of George Floyds and this Black Lives Matter moment, if I can call it that, has been a moment of controversy. Thank God for those who have stood. I was one of those who actually was protesting outside Parliament. We marched down Whitehall. We stopped at number 10. We made a load of noise and we moved on to Trafalgar Square. And that wasn't just Black people. That was white allies standing with us, and we're grateful. May God unite his church as one on this vital issue of the sanctity of each and every person and their human life, no matter what the colour of their skin is. At the end of the day, race is a human construct. There's more in common with the DNA of someone from East Africa, somewhere like Somalia and Sweden, than there is from someone from Somalia and say someone like from West Africa. And so cut us through the middle, and we're all human beings.
Great. Well, Mike, it's been great talking to you. Is there anything that the folks that are watching this podcast can pray for you in your work or your ministry? What could we pray for?
Yeah, I would ask people to pray for the church, that they understand the issue of racial justice as an issue of mission. How can we prepare ourselves to receive in love those who are other, in the spirit of the Good Samaritan, a key motif, a story, of course, that Jesus tells. That would be my prayer. How, as organisation of churches, can we prepare ourselves to minister in the spirit of what Jesus was looking for when he answered the question, who is my neighbour? And
if you had to recommend one or two books or podcasts or something, or TED Talks, what would you recommend for people that want to dig a bit deeper?
Wow, yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of books I would recommend. So I think Ben Lindsay's book, We Need to Talk About Race. I think that I would encourage people to read that book. The other book that's come out quite recently that I would encourage people to look at was written by a good friend of mine, an Anglican priest, Azariah France Gauchip, that just really looks at the whole issue of racism in the Anglican Church. And then Chinny MacDonald is just about to release a new book, God is Not a White Man. I think that is really worth a look too. So those are just 3 books that I would say have a look at. I've done some stuff with New Wine, which you can find on YouTube. I did 3 seminars, one with Steve Clifford and Yemi Adedeji, on one with Ben Lindsay actually, and then one in conversation with Isabel Parisham and Kate Coleman and also with a church in Leicester with Elaine Sutherland. You can find those on the New Wine Network. We did those last summer. They're really worth listening to because it's about the church engaging with this issue.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for taking time to chat to Ragged Theology podcast. It's been a great time of learning for me, and we just pray, God's richest blessing on your leadership around this issue and on your church life and your family life. So, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been a great honour and a pleasure. God bless you all.